We have Amelia talking about data, documentation, and memory.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me today. My name is Amelia Abreu. I gotta change something. Okay, never mind. My name is Amelia Abreu. I am here to give a very unpractical talk. I want to talk about some of the theories behind documentation and to contemplate a little bit more what we're doing as documentarians. And, one of the great things about this conference is participating in this culture of documentation. So drilling it a little bit deeper, I hope to raise some questions. So to give you a little background about me, I started off as an archivist. And is anyone a fan of the blog Letters of Note? Yeah, so as you can see in this really great CBS Records memo, this is awesome documentation that shows that, someone called Ted and said that Miles wanted to call his record Bitches Brew, and that he needed some advice. And this shows so much about the values and process and just general environment at CBS Records in 1969. And this is the best part of any archivist today, is finding this one interesting morsel that says, oh my goodness, this documents a moment that was happening. Because a lot of what archivists do is answer questions about people's great-grandfathers and remove staples. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of things today. I'm going to talk about the relationship between documentation and work, drawing on my experiences working in UX research. I'm going to talk about the ill-fated documentalist movement from Europe in the mid-20th century. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, metadata, and I'd like to argue that documentation is a really potent form of metadata, and I'll talk about my theory of meta-documentation. And I'm going to talk about probably my favorite topic, which is information infrastructure, of which documentarians play a huge part. So the first question is, what is it that we document? I started out as an archivist and got really interested in all of the systems that surrounded the archives. I went to University of Texas at Austin to study literary manuscripts. And in 2005, just as I was graduating, the Harry Ransom Center, which is a huge literary manuscripts collection at UT, paid a lot of money to acquisition Norman Mailer's papers. And with that acquisition came, I think, 4 or 5 rotting laptops. They were in terrible condition. And I don't even think Norman Mailer had ever touched them. These were his secretary's laptops. And over the next couple of years, several of my friends and I worked on this project of doing digital preservation and getting all of these emails and drafts and notes, just as banal as that memo you just saw, off of 10 and 15-year-old laptops. Anyway, I got so interested in that process of how what we do gets stuck in technosocial systems that I went back to school again to get a PhD in human-computer interaction. And through a few twists and turns, I ended up in the UX world, and I've worked with big research labs at major tech companies. I've worked with startups, and I just started a job a few months ago with Conway Freight in their enterprise software division. And a few of my coworkers are here. But anyway, moving forward, one of the things that is awesome about working in UX is that we are consumers of documentation. And when we go in to look at the way that people use technology in their work, we look for the documentation. But we don't just look for the documentation, we look for what is not documented. And here we have what's called, I learned this framework in grad school the second time around, and we call it the onion. It's called cognitive work analysis, and this was developed in the 1980s by psychologists who were interested in how nuclear plant technicians did their jobs. And as you can see, the documentation is in the middle of the onion, and there's a lot of stuff that happens all around it. And this is sort of an ugly graphic, and I've always told myself I wanted to redo it. But I was thinking about how to teach this best to my undergrad students, and I realized that if we were going to think about nuclear technicians, let's think about our favorite one, Homer Simpson, and we can call this onion a donut. So, moving forward, as a researcher, we do ethnographic interviews, we do secondary data analysis, and we look at the evidence of evidence. And a lot of times what we work with is finding things that are off the record, finding things that are outside of the realm of documentation. Why doesn't the documentation tell us how to do X, Y, or Z? Why does the manager tell us one thing and the employees tell us the other? And that's the real meat of our work, is looking at the donuts outside of Homer Simpson's control station. And so today I'm less interested and probably a lot less qualified to talk about the nuts and bolts of documentation in a practical sense, but I want to talk more about the ideals behind it. So this is Suzanne Brier, who is known in France in the 1950s as Madame Documentation. And she was born in 1894 in the French countryside, and in 1924 became one of the 3 first female librarians at the Bibliothèque Nationale. She stayed at the Bibliothèque Nationale until 1959. And what happened in France in between 1924 and 1959? A lot of stuff. And she stayed at her post throughout 2 world wars, throughout the German invasion, and was witness to a lot of political and intellectual history. And towards the twilight of her career, she spearheaded the documentalist movement, which was a push not only to improve practices of documentation, but to develop a science around it. She has this great quote, which I don't speak French, but it's like erudition is boring, science is revolutionary. And her masterwork was called What is Documentation, which is available freely as a PDF and translated into English, and is 80 pages of just pedal to the metal, like asking the tough questions about why we document the things that we document. Brier was part of a larger movement that really picked up steam after World War II, and she worked with a man named Paul Otlet, who sort of like developed a sort of documentalist syndicate. Microfilm was developed during the Second World War, and they thought, hey, we can use this to change the world. If we just microfilm all of the great works and send them around the world, we'll have world peace. It's interesting to note that the French documentalists during the occupation collaborated with the German documentalist movement, which had different motives than world peace. And this, I think one of the reasons why I bring them up is A, because they're fascinating and nobody knows who they are, but B, they can tell us a lot about our own techno-social situation. We're in a lot different circumstance than 1950s France, but we have a lot in common. We still have these social ideals that we can use technology created under less auspicious circumstances to really improve people's lives, and that we can also, through using a scientific practice or using the right methods, create a better world. And you can see a lot of the traces of folks like this in contemporary commerce. I pulled this quote out of Colm Tobin's review of the new book about Amazon, The Everything Store, saying that Amazon's business model was not just to sell books; it was to gather data. And we're living in the same situation as Brie and Otley, where we're trying to use metadata, and I use that term really broadly to mean processes and tools to access and organize reams of data to make our data more of a commodity. And most of us might think of metadata as limited to schemas or to what an enterprise architect does. Metadata is at the core of everything we do. It's how we navigate institutional structures. And you can think of this at play every day. Just think about when you order a Chemex coffee filter, a Chemex coffee maker on Amazon. They so helpfully suggest that you order the weird square filters, which my grandmother is very much a product of the Depression and was also an enthusiastic Chemex owner the first time they were around, and told me very helpfully that I could just get out my sewing machine and cut my Chemex filters in half, and just use half of one. Metadata. Next, I'm going to move into the idea of information infrastructure. And as documentarians, we are providers, enforcers, and builders of that infrastructure. And here you can see the steel bridge. And for folks who are visiting Portland from out of town, we are a city of bridges, and we place immense importance on these pieces of infrastructure. This is the steel bridge. It was built in 1912. It is I have this written down. It is a through-truss double-deck vertical lift bridge, and it is the only double-deck bridge with an independent lift in the world. And if you're driving through it on a car or riding the light rail, it looks like every other bridge. But if you ride your bike or walk underneath it, you have a whole level of the bridge that's just your own. And this to me is a really interesting illustration of infrastructural inversion. Because when you ride your bike underneath the steel bridge, as I did today, it doesn't feel like you can hear the rattling of the light rail or cars, but you really do feel like this is built for you, which is not something you feel a lot as a bicyclist in an urban area. And I draw on Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, who are science and technology scholars, who have written extensively about information infrastructure. And their work has covered nurses, it's covered people who are allergic to onions, it's covered worm farmers and permaculture gardeners, as folks who come up against infrastructure in their day-to-day activities. And this sentiment really resonates with me because they refute a lot of what our conventional thinking is about building technologies. They say to de-emphasize the technical versus non-technical elements, which this is something that I've noticed a lot here today. There's not a question of, as writers and documentarians, we're not technical, because there's not, that definition is very flawed. There's a lot of overlap that's going in between this, and in order to make a long-term investment, those divisions are not very useful. Bowker and Starr also emphasize recognizing human work as infrastructure. And I really like Bowker's definition of infrastructure as pervasive enabling resources in network form. And so that can be an administrative assistant pool, that can be an office SharePoint, that can be a robust system of documentation. Another quote from Starr is, she says that infrastructure is relational. The daily work of one person is the infrastructure of another. And in advocating for infrastructural inversion, they advocate to show several standpoints in relation to any infrastructural tool, and to shift the focus from components, say a tool, or a development process, or job titles and roles, and to relationship. And documentation as infrastructure is a long-term investment. Infrastructures are used in ways that often exhaust the best intentions of those who created them, just as documentation does. How many times have you gone to use an old tool and looked at documentation that's 5 or 10 years old? And as you can see, as we saw in Heidi's talk, oftentimes the sheriff has left town. And the sheriff's best intention has been exhausted. And in my work, I think that right now in my work, I'm trying to think about a philosophy that emphasizes processes over artifacts, but then thinks about the artifacts. And I really like the work that Bruno Latour has done on quote-unquote big data, where he makes the argument that the whole is almost always smaller than its parts. The individual or group uses of a tool, of a process, always has a half-life that's beyond what we might have imagined. So to keep those things in mind in terms of creating long-term structures. So where am I headed with this? I would like to go back to the archive. And I'd like to close by not only speculating on the long-term nature of documentation, which you probably all know, but to look at the long life of our bureaucratic forms. There's this really great book called The Big Archive, where Sven Steicher, who's a Swedish art historian, looks at this long relationship between art and bureaucracy, starting with the Dadaists and moving forward. And here's an example of really great bureaucratic art. This is Robert Morris's Card File, which is often thought of as one of the first big works of conceptual art from the 60s. And this is a standard issue industrial card file, which was probably in every office at that era, and in which he's made elaborate documentation about every step in the process that he used to make this piece of art. And that in itself was a pretty profound commentary on office work and knowledge work and the nature of work in 1962. And, as technical documentations, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that we are engaging in bureaucratic structures of our own. The development process is its own form of bureaucracy, and we have a really great opportunity not just to witness it and to sort of watch it unfold, but also to play with it, to engage with it creatively. And we're in the age where developers are thought of as very creative individuals, but there's room for that in other aspects of technical work. We are in this room, I think we are engaging in creating a new culture of documentation, and I hope that there's room for that playfulness in there as well. And I added a sloth. And so I'd like to wrap up by just saying how appreciative I am to join in this conversation and to thank you all for listening. I am on Twitter, that's as my name. So thanks.